The sinew that connects us all is incredibly volatile. It can be as strong and efficient as muscle fibers working to keep us moving every day, or it can be as delicate as the brain, any slight interference setting off the balance completely. This sinew is similar to the relationships between us and the diplomacy that we engage in because it determines the strength of our individual selves. The diplomacy between our nations even more so. While ultimately, all nation states work for their own best interests, it is beneficial for us all to engage in diplomacy and advance the collective interests of humanity. This is the primary reason that diplomacy persists as the most successful platform to attain one's needs. Leagues like the United Nations and the European Union have formed and engaged in successful diplomacy, showing us that it is in fact attainable. But the rising and falling of Arab unification, Pan-Arabism, and the establishment of an Arab League is the perfect canvas to view the opposite of all that: the failures, many successes, and obstacles of diplomacy. These are all valuable lessons as we attempt to move on to a more globalist view of the world, and we intend to analyze them in this documentary. Founded in 1945, the Arab League is arguably one of the oldest still existing international organizations in the world. The League started with 7 countries: Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Transjordan, and Yemen, eventually growing to include 15 more nations. The goals of the Arab League were simple: to strengthen the relationship between Arab states while working towards goals of political, economic, cultural, and scientific cooperation. Ultimately, the goal of the Arab League was to pursue Arab unification, the unification of a people with a similar language, history, culture, and religion. The idea was very popular among the populace of the majority of Arab nations. However, politicians continued to disagree in their diplomatic efforts. Many of the plans put forward by the Arab League ended up suspended or delayed, and since the Arab Spring revolts that happened in the early 2010s, the Arab League has remained noticeably dormant. The League was the perfect guise for fake diplomacy. Politicians could continually pay lip service to the ideas that they brought forward without ever having to actually put them into practice. To this day, there is still no judicial body of the Arab League, even though one was suggested all the way back in 2014. Despite the people wanting their ideas to happen and for them to be considered a one united Arab people, the catastrophic failure of diplomacy would lead to the rise of nationalist ideas and uprisings. The people were clearly not being heard, and deals were not being arranged, so they began to take matters into their own hands. Pan-Arabism is the idea that the Arab states should be unified and took root really in the 1960s, 1970s, with many different projects to try and attempt to unify the Arab nations. However, all of them ultimately failed due to diplomatic complications. Ba'athism is the older of the two Pan-Arabist ideologies. It is a socialist movement that aims for the unification of all Arab states and the rights of Arab workers. The union saw its height during the Cold War and received support from the Soviet Union due to its socialist leanings. Influential Ba'athist figures included Gamal Abdel Nasser and Anwar al-Sadat. Nowadays, Bashar al-Assad is one of the only Arab leaders who still follows an ideology similar to or descended from Ba'ath. All of the previous unifications of Arab states were a direct result of this ideology and the diplomatic relations thereof. Gamal Abdel Nasser was even referred to as the last Arab for his constant efforts diplomatically in establishing an actual Arab state. The United Arab Republic was the first state of this kind. It was a union between Syria and Egypt that had been in the talks for around 4 years after Gamal Abdel Nasser went to power. It existed for roughly 13 years as the longest physical union between Arab nations. It was one of Nasser's prouder achievements in his life, despite the union's short lifespan. The main diplomatic errors came from unequally leveraging power between the two nations. Despite being loyal to the Ba'athist movement, the Syrian division of the Republic felt like they were being left out of resources and opportunities. Additionally, the fact that the two parts of the nation were separated by Israel caused severe logistical issues for the country to function normally. The next major Pan-Arabist ideology was the Third International Theory. Third International Theory was the culmination of ideas put together by Muammar Gaddafi, often cited from his Green Book. Though in the cultural West he's been demonized as an absolute dictator, many of his own citizens did not view him that way. While views of him are still controversial, he worked on the development and progression of Libya despite other circumstances of his rule. For example, it is a known fact that under Gaddafi, many Libyans enjoyed things like free healthcare and free university tuitions. The Federation of Arab Republics was the union attempted by Muammar al-Gaddafi after the death of Gamal Abdel Nasser to try and hold the ideas of Pan-Arabism steady, not letting their flames die out. While the charter was signed on paper, there still existed many problems. The Syrian and Egyptian legs of the Union, for example, operated almost completely independently of the Libyan division. Without warning, Egypt and Syria launched a joint attack on Israel, starting the October Yom Kippur War. Due to disregard for the others, diplomats and diplomacy in general, the Federation nearly completely collapsed after its first year and no longer even existed on paper after 5 years. Overall, if there were a more perfect scenario or argument for people to be united as one, it must go to the Arabs. They share a similar, if not identical, language, culture, and religion, but yet still find themselves incapable of binding themselves in unison. They even have a common banner to unite under, the establishment of a Palestinian state, however still fall short in this goal. All of this ultimately stems from a clear, analyzable failure of diplomacy, where the administrators of a nation are not informed about the inner workings of another. While this speaks for the nations themselves, it also speaks for the great mistrust that has spread throughout our society and poisoned relationships between us when we should be united. The failure of these unions ultimately resulted in the suffering of people who wanted nothing more than to stand together. As we move towards a more globalist society, we must use these failures as stepping stones to improve upon what we already know. Improving upon diplomacy should always be one of humanity's goals, seeing as its fruits are sweeter than any, and the bitterness of its absence leaves people hungry.